Good morning and welcome back to the lecture series on Partition of India in Print Media and Cinema. So, we are talking about the accounts of the survivor and we are discussing Cracking India in continuation from our previous discussions on this novel. We are going to talk further about Lenny's perspective, the juvenile perspective, and how the innocent child is transformed into a guilt-stricken adult as there is a loss of trust, and she actually loses a part of her childhood in the course in the due course of her the narrative, in the due course of the novel. So, by the time the country is partitioned and two new nations are born, the mental scape with the geographical scape, the political scape, the mental scape of the child is transformed, and we were talking about how guilt is a major motivation that propels this narrative. This narrative is actually recounted in hindsight as a way of purging the child. It is a kind of expiation on Lenny's part for having diverged about Ayah to the ice candy man, which actually ruins, which goes on to ruin Ayah's life. And so, it is also the story of losing one's trust. It is a story of a drastic change in human relationships, in long-standing friendships beyond any reconciliation. So, Lenny lists the names of the nationalist leaders that she hears, and she realizes that she has become aware of religious differences at a very young age. Lenny learns about realities such as religion. She starts asking about what is God, because she sees different people worshipping different gods, and that is actually the point of disagreement among different communities. This is also something she learns with the passage of time. So, this sudden transformation is linked with the amplification of the nationalist rhetoric and the political struggle, which eventually considers partition as a viable option, and finally partition as the only option. So, Lenny says, one day everyone is themselves and the next day they are Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian. People shrink, dwindling into symbols. Ayah is no longer just my all-encompassing Ayah. She is also a token, a Hindu. Carried away by a renewed devotional fervor, she spends a small fortune on joss sticks, flowers and sweets on the gods and goddesses in the temples. So, Cracking India follows the perspective of Lenny in the period before partition and during the partition riots, from the position of an affluent Parsee family in Lahore, and from the perspective of a specially able child, female child that grows up in a multi-religious household. So, her household, we see that she does not actually, she is not accompanied by her parents all the time. The people that influence her the most are her caretakers, her nanny and the nanny's suitors, and they all come from varied communal backgrounds. So, the nanny Ayah is a Hindu Punjabi, her suitors, the monsieur is a Muslim, the ice candy man is also a Muslim, the gardener actually converts and becomes a Christian. So, one sees that the household has a kind of motley existence, and that is Lenny's microcosm. Her parents are typically elite and distant, and they leave the daily raising of Lenny, the daily raising of Lenny to her nanny. And so other servants are from different backgrounds, like we have already said, and the ice candy man we see is called so because he sometimes sells ice cream. And we see towards the beginning of the narrative that none of these people, who are all subalterns, are stringent followers of their respective religions. So, for example, the ice candy man actually treats religion as a claptrap thing. He barely believes in God, and he makes his earning through guising, through disguising, or through disguising as a fraud priest, or a fraud Muslim priest, who apparently who purportedly connects between God and the common people. And so we realize that a religion for these people is farce. They are not very religious people till the later part of the narration, till the later part of the novel, where they are all becoming visibly Hindus and Muslims. And so, as the violence of partition rises, one sees that the ice candy man, who used to make earning through fraudulently exploiting religion and people's faith, suddenly turns to political and religious sermonizing. He takes on the role of a minor and a leader who speaks in the same tone as the nationalist leaders, and so he becomes an important figure in their area. He is the one that leads the mob to Lenny's house, and he is responsible for the abduction of Ayah and for selling her to a brothel. So, later the readers get to know that the ice candy man was instrumental. He played an important role. He was instrumental in pimping Ayah as a dancer in the red light district of Lahore. And later on, it is only through the godmother's intervention, the godmother being a powerful female figure, that Ayah is rescued from her situation, and thereafter one sees that the ice candy man actually disappears. He crosses the border into India and disappears. So, as Parsee's, Lenny's family has hardly any interest in entering into the communal dispute or the disputatious arguments or the political contests, communal political contests and disputations between the Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs. So, there is a point where the character called Colonel Bharucha says that the real fight is of who gets the power after the British goes, after the Britishers leave. And he says that Hindus, Muslims and even the Sikhs are going to jockey for power. And if you jokers, implying the Parsees, if you jokers jump into the middle, you will be mangled into chutney. So, this is what Bharucha has to say, and this actually tells a lot about the minority community of the Parsee people, the minority community that the Parsees are in India. So, Parsees actually, so Lenny finds that the Parsees are reduced to irrelevant nomenclatures. And I would hearken back the unreal existence on Warris Road that Lenny talks about. So, her unreal address, they are as good as invisible, as not there, because they do not participate in the disputatious relationships among different communities. So, they are actually not engaging, the Parsees are not actively a participant, an enactor or a protagonist in this entire event, in this chapter of in the chapter of partition, historical event of partition. So, they are almost nobody, they are nobody people between the Hindus and the Muslim communities that were mobilized by nationalist rhetoric. So, this leads Lenny to ask a fundamental question such as, what is God? Whose God is the real God actually? Whose God is the real God? So, in Cracking India, the nationalist rhetoric seems to prevail as the narrative explores how the stories of individual traumas actually resonate with the trauma of the nation, how individual stories are allegories for the trauma of the nation and vice versa. And this echoes what the literary critics have already articulated in their work regarding the inextricable relationship between the individual and the collective, how the individual is a part of the collective and vice versa. So, we see this being reflected in Cracking India. So, it presents, the story presents an intriguing feminist lens through which the traumas of war and communal violence are addressed. So, the narrative erases the distinction between literary work and critical social history. One could read Cracking India in so many different ways, as the autobiography of a juvenile, as an account of confession, a confessional account, as a critical social history, as well as a fiction, a work of fiction and a literary work. And in many ways it has the quality of what could be termed as a counter history, something that is shifting, something that has moved away from the larger nationalistic events, the celebratory the celebratory aspects or the celebratory stories that one get to hear most often about the independence of India. So, it is a counter, it is a kind of counter narration to the such glorified picturization, glorified imagination of anti-colonial struggles. So, away from that, it is a story of a microcosm, right, and of a child growing up during partition. So, Lenny, we see, is protected by her family's wealth and stability, and therefore not directly affected by virtue of being wealthy and being part of a minority community, the community of the Parsees. She is hardly affected by these chaotic conditions. She is ensconced and lives predominantly in the women's world, and spends most of her time either with Ayah or with some elderly woman, with an elderly woman that she calls as her godmother. She does not have a very direct interface with men's world although she definitely communicates on an everyday level, she communicates with the ice candy man and the monsieur. These are all subalterns, and they are not male protagonists. They are not the hypermasculine characters until of course Ice Candy Man transforms himself and becomes someone similar to the nationalistic leaders, to the nationalist leaders. So although she knows men around her, they do not play a vital role in churning the larger national the larger events in the nation. So they are chiefly subalterns. The world of men remains shadowy on the personal level of Lenny, except her encounter with her cousin. So that's an a juvenile male she encounters who is trying to explore his newly discovered sexuality, and that's where we see that the two children are talking about topics that are generally discussed among the adults. So men on the national level who make decisions for everyone remain incomprehensible and mythical figures for Lenny. As she understands, there are some men that are remote, cannot be easily accessed, and the ones that are calculating, that are that are responsible for creating the climate of violence. Their decisions, their machinations and schemings are actually imposed on the ordinary people, and their machinations are carried out by the ordinary men who merely act as cogs and as pawns in the hands of such leaders. So while describing her meeting with Gandhi, Lenny mentions how she lowers her eyes in the vicinity of a man for the first time, and then she starts to understand, later on when she starts to understand the magnanimity, the impact and the dimension of the amount of damage that has been wrought by this massacre and the role of the men in it. She says, "When I raised my head again, the men lowered their eyes." So when she raises her head, she means to say that it's a kind of counter gaze. It's her feminine self. It's a transformation from being a juvenile to becoming a feminine subject who starts understanding who starts actually engaging with the larger scheme. And so when she raises her head, there are questions which cannot be answered by the men, and so they lower their eyes. So this is a process of Lenny transforming, or Lenny's entry into adulthood, into womanhood, right? This brings about a kind of revelation. This happens as a result of a revelation of the biggest truth of partition, and Lenny realizes that it's a decision taken by men which impacts women much more than it impacts the men. So this sentence is spoken by an adult and feminine self in Lenny. So one sees that a section of the society is concerned about women being exposed to the gory violence especially in the initial phase. So, the Monsieur, for example, is concerned, he is expressing his concern by saying that Lenny and Ayah should not witness the riot scenes, they should not see such things. So, later on women are actually the recipient of the greatest form of violence, they are brutally raped and murdered. So, the initial sensitivity where women are barred from seeing an act of violence actually is replaced by the woman's body becoming the site of violence. So, and this is the kind of man we see that I mean the Monsieur is the kind of man that Ayah would call as a gentleman, and that is precisely why she gets attracted to the Monsieur, because he wants to protect Ayah and take her away from the violent scenes. On the other hand, we have the figure of the ice candy man, otherwise a fun loving and frolicking man who later on implores, who beseeches that Ayah marry him, and if Ayah becomes his wife, his partner, then he would be able to control the animal in him. Because Ayah refuses the ice candy man, the animal in him is unleashed. So, we see here that love, expression of love or romantic overtures also take on a hypermasculinist tone. So, ice candy man from being a flirtatious, from transforming from his flirtatious romantic self, he wants to marry Ayah merely to control the animal feelings. So, there is also this question of the ice candy man wanting to marry Ayah in response to his own sister being raped by the Hindus. So, one could see this entire romantic overture through a communal meaning, where ice candy man is not merely Ayah's suitor, but a Muslim fanatic wanting to establish his claim and control over the Hindu woman's body. So, all these equations, the long standing friendships, romantic relations transform and take on communal, they acquire communal colorations, and so situation becomes grave and serious. What's ironical is that at the heart of this communal disturbance, we have the story of a love triangle seen through Lenny's eyes, where a Muslim, the arch rivals are both Muslims. So, Ayah's lovers are both Muslims, and in the end a Muslim man actually ends up killing another Muslim man as a way of taking revenge. So, so this we see that human behavior, being extremely complex, cannot be fitted very well to explain, to merely explain, cannot be fitted or contained within the communal rhetoric, the rhetoric of communal rivalry and enmity, because in this story we see that in this narrative we see that a Muslim actually goes on to kill another Muslim, like I said, which does not fit very well into the Hindu versus Muslim rhetoric. So, the concept of bodily violence and animosity inflicted on women's body becomes part of children's conversation. It becomes part of the child's common parlance, and at a point Lenny and her cousin are seen as enacting the rape of a rag doll. It becomes part of children's game, and like I have already discussed before, we see the children talking about Giri hui aurat, the fallen women who were actually rape victims. So, we see that they are acquiring some understanding of partition through sometimes through direct witnessing, and sometimes they are picking up from what the adults say. So, Ayah from the beginning, right from the beginning of the narrative, one sees that Ayah is admired by a range of men for her beauty, and yet she is not spared by the brutality of the partition, and her trust is actually all the men actually fail her. So those she trusted all her life become the reason, they become the reason of her devastation. She is raped, she is abducted, she is raped and abducted, and her converted, and she is forced to convert her profession into a dancing girl. And later on, it is the godmother who is a figure of great strength, and so she rescues Ayah and helps her escape to India. So, yet Ayah's shock for all the assault that she underwent converts her into a woman that is bereft of emotions and affection. And so Lenny, the narrator, talks about her unfeeling eyes, which summarize the pain she has undergone, she has suffered, and which has left her an unhappy woman. From a chirpy, bubbly woman that Ayah was, she turned into a body that could merely and mechanically, function, callous, individual, or a callously functioning body. So, her character embodies the sufferings that thousands of women actually underwent during the partition. And with this, I am going to stop today's lecture. I will meet you again for another round of lectures. Thank you.